Redshift here, doing my part to shift perceptions out of the pink and into the red. Emotion is bullshit. Emotion means manipulation. If you are feeling emotions, you are being manipulated. You're being manipulated by women, or you're being manipulated by your life experiences, or you're being manipulated by greed, or you're being manipulated by government, or by corporations, or by religion, or by your fears, or by your family. Emotion is inherently manipulative. Emotion is nature's way of manipulating us. So going MGTOW is not enough. It doesn't get you past emotion. It doesn't get you past your drive to procreate. It doesn't get you past your drive to survive. But outside of those two things, your drive to procreate and your drive to survive, there's no reason you can't mostly cut emotion out of your life. And you should. You should also cut thought out of your life as much as possible. Awareness is superior to thought and should be cultivated. But it's far better to cultivate awareness and have a philosophical understanding of shunyata and anatta, which means emptiness and no self, respectively. This philosophical understanding and viewpoint is very important to have. Very important. Why is that, you ask? Well, it's important so that you don't get yourself attached to negative habits of thought. If you think there's a self, a you, if you don't realize that your thoughts are not yourself, then if you start having negative thoughts that scare you, then you'll only feed those thoughts by thinking that that's you and that you're evil. But if you know that those thoughts are just thoughts and aren't you, then you won't feed them as much, and more importantly, you won't attach to them as you. You will realize that there's no self. And so any thoughts, no matter how weird, evil, or persistent, etc., they're not you. This lack of clinging to thoughts keeps you from changing in a negative way when these thoughts arise. You can let them go, and you can identify with nothing. And if you have to identify with something, because identifying with things is a tendency that we human beings have, it's a delusional tendency, but it's a tendency we have nonetheless, one that takes a lot of effort to overcome. If you have to identify with something, then you can identify with the irrefutable wisdom that nothing is self, that your thoughts aren't you, that everything changes and passes away, that everything is in a constant state of flux. When you go to sleep or wake up, there is something called hypnopompic and hypnagogic imagery that can happen. You can have ideas pop into your head out of nowhere. You can see images of odd things in vivid detail, that it's so vivid that it's like watching a movie. Similar things can also happen when you orgasm. Weird things can come to mind. What does this mean? It means not just that we are not what we think we are, but also that we do not exist at all. Our thoughts, feelings, perceptions, inspirations, insights, etc. are not under our control. They arise out of an interplay between the most shallow, sterile, biased, impotent, and hollow functions of the brain and the vast primeval Jurassic jungle that lies below the neocortex, that secretly directs the brain's puerile puppet show above. The savage still rules the world. It now merely does so by proxy. The savage is chaotic, unrestrained, inextricable, while the interplay between it and the mechanized factory above is merely a phantom, an illusion. The savage is no more ourself than what we do in a state of being blackout drunk is. We may kill someone, rape someone, or tell silly jokes while being blackout drunk. There's no will there when you're blackout drunk. There's no choice there. There's no normality there. Some people are happy drunks. Some people are angry, violent drunks, even if they're not normally violent at all when they're sober. They're not their real self when they're drunk. You hear people apologize and say, "I'm sorry, I wasn't in my right mind." And people often say that when they're not even under the influence of anything other than stress. How much more is the boiling inferno of primal lust, rage, desire for survival, and other things out of our control? We are not our thoughts. We are not the visions and inspirations that occur to us out of the blue. Whether they be good or bad, beautiful or ugly, intense or faint, strange or pedestrian. And we are not our everyday conscious thoughts that we think of as being us. Another thing is that thought and mind are two radically different things. Thought is mechanical and often much slower, maybe always slower. Mind is awareness, consciousness, and can be partly or even fully devoid of thought. Awareness has a spatial and luminous quality. There's a reason taking psychedelics is called expanding the mind. It's because mind becomes more aware of three-dimensional space, as if awareness itself were literally growing and expanding. This happens as awareness strengthens and connects to itself, and simultaneously crowds out thought. Thought is dead. Mind is alive. But even mind is not the source of the savage. Mind can illuminate and control the savage, but it is not the source of the savage. The biological drives to procreate and kill and run, in other words, to fuck and to survive, are the savage. They are built into our very DNA. We cannot abolish the savage. We can understand it and corral it, and even somewhat fuse with it in order to more harmoniously control it, but we cannot kill it. At least that's what I surmise from the fact that so few Buddhist monks in history attain full enlightenment. As well as from the fact that I don't believe in the supernatural, and my experience is that biology cannot be denied. So why is the fact that we cannot kill it important? It's important because it is absolutely critical that people understand that the thoughts that go through their brain are not a self. Even the broader mind of awareness itself is not a self. The feelings that happen to people are not a self. The body is not a self. If your body were yourself, then you could heal it by mind alone, and you could keep it from aging. And even then it wouldn't be yourself, because it would be composed of parts, and whatever is composed of parts is not one thing, but merely a pile of smaller things clumped together. That's it. People cling to what they consider to be their self, and clinging is the source of most suffering. People only suffer the fear of death because they cling to life. People kill and steal and do other horrible things in order to not be poor because they cling to the pleasures that would be lost if they were to drop to a lower caste in society. And make no mistake, we do live in a caste society. It's merely a less official and more fluid one than the one of India. Do women and even men not treat poor men as pariahs, as if they were untouchables? Do not the rich live insulated lives of luxury where the smallest problems are magnified and where they have no real conception of how the other 99.99% of the population lives? Now, while only the permanent brain change of what the religious call enlightenment can give us permanent and near total control over our most basic nature, it does not change our DNA. Clinging for the average person is almost impossible to conquer, but it should be viewed as what it is. Basically the root of suffering, and it should be diminished as much as possible. When people are young, they are foolish and benighted, and thus they seek to maximize pleasure. But life is not about maximizing pleasure. Life is about minimizing pain. As life progresses, pleasure becomes harder and harder to obtain, because a person learns what is really important in life. Like Hyman Roth said in The Godfather Part 2, about how he would give anything to have an improvement in his health, or to live another 10 or 20 years, health is more important than money, more important than being good-looking, more important than being famous, more important than status, more important than being well-liked, more important than power, more important than being charming. Health is more important than being well-educated and more important than being experienced and well-traveled. Health is more important. Good health is more important than pretty much anything, except perhaps moral character and or wisdom. Without health, there is nothing that means anything. Health is the first and most important form of wealth and power. A great meal when you're young can be a memorable experience, but the standard for a great meal gets higher and higher the longer you live. The same with sexual experiences, the same with movies and TV shows. This principle applies to basically everything. But even when you do manage to buck the odds in your 40s and 50s and have a great sexual experience or a great meal or you see a great movie or whatever, then it still doesn't make you as happy. It will give you pleasure and you can appreciate that and it can please you, but that's different than it making you happy. But physical discomfort and pain both increase as you get older. So it becomes more and more obvious as you age that sex, good food, etc. are not really what is important at all. This is why men often realize the wisdom of MGTOW later on in life, in their 40s, because they begin to realize that cutting out stress as well as other negative things is more important than having nice, pleasant things, such as companionship, sex, etc. If the cost of pleasure is stress or pain, then it's better to not have the pleasure, and thereby spare yourself the pain. There is a glorification of emotional pain in TV shows and movies, and in society at large, as if the pleasure or novelty of the experience makes the suffering that goes along with it worthwhile. Like that South Park episode where Stan becomes a goth kid, and at the end he stops being a goth kid when he sees Butters crying, and Butters calls it a beautiful sadness and says you have to take the good with the bad. But that's bullshit. That's like saying herpes is a beautiful STD, and you have to take the STDs with the sex because that's how life is. You see how preposterous that is? It's better to avoid suffering than to seek pleasure and endure the unavoidable suffering that can go along with pleasure, such as living with a woman. Now, if, like having sex with a condom, you gain pleasure while eliminating the downside, then fantastic, go for it. But if there's an unavoidable downside that goes with some kind of pleasure, You have to weigh the downside against the upside, and if the downside is minimal, then maybe it's worth it. But when it comes to women, the downside is usually significant, not minimal. When you date, it's not worth it because either the relationship was short, in which case it was a waste of time, or it's longer term, in which case the stress, the arguments, her flakiness, or even your heartbreak at the end are the cost of the relationship. And when I say cost, I mean downside. But eventually the relationship ends, and so it ends up not being worth it because nothing of lasting value is produced from the relationship, and thus it is only worth it if in some future point in time you find a unicorn. Then all the past relationships will have been proven to not be a waste of time because they were the cost of eventually finding the unicorn. But until you find the unicorn, you don't know if you ever will find a unicorn, and thus you don't know if you're wasting your time or not. So, you should judge whether the dating is worth it on its own, not by the hypothetical possibility of those relationships gaining retroactive value after finding a unicorn. Thus, is the stress of the relationship worth the sex and pleasant times of companionship? If the answer is no, then stop dating her, and seriously consider abandoning dating altogether. Even having various fuck buddies can be viewed as something that fails the cost-benefit analysis. There's risk of STDs. And even pregnancy. I mean, condoms do break. So what are the options? Well, you can be celibate, in which case your body will crave sex, there's no escaping it, or you can have fuck buddies or friends with benefits, but there's still STD and pregnancy risks. You can short-term date, but that's emotionally unideal. It's not ideal. You can long-term date, but that's stressful and unpleasant because you both get sick of each other and make each other angry a lot and you stress each other out, especially her stressing you out. So you can either meet your sexual and emotional needs and be poisoned thereby, or you can not meet your needs and feel unfulfilled and harassed by desire for what doesn't satisfy anyway, and what you know won't satisfy you, but what you nevertheless can't stop craving. So either you give into your biology and see how empty the result is, or you deny your biology and keep getting harassed by it. There's no winning. It's crappy door number 1 or crappy door number 2. It's walking along a tightrope with lava on the right and water full of hungry crocodiles and piranha on the left. So it's not an issue of finding happiness, at least as long as you're not going to become a monk and devote yourself to achieving the bliss of advanced meditation in order to eventually gain full enlightenment and the perfect happiness of full enlightenment. If you're not a monk, a real monk, like a Buddhist monk, I'm not talking about a MGTOW monk. If you're not like a Buddhist monk, then it's an issue of minimizing one's suffering. How does one do this? Well, ignoring your wife or girlfriend when she's bitching at you is a strategy that a lot of blue pill guys use. Having fuck buddies or short-term relationships or just not dating at all while using masturbation to meet one's sexual needs are strategies used by red pill guys. The blue pill strategy is not very effective because women are masters of the psyche. They know how to push men's buttons. The red pill strategies are good, but can still be quite painful for men who aren't naturally red pill. Some men are genetically wired for the red pill, and for them, discovering MGTOW is just discovering a bunch of like-minded men because such a man already knew and understood much of what MGTOW teaches and already lived a red pill life. Other men are genetically wired for the blue pill. They are gentle and kind and are totally devoid of ruthlessness. Such men tend to crave romantic love as much as they crave sex. For such men, discovering MGTOW is a strange or even horrifying experience, and the truth is hard to accept. And if they do manage to accept it, it remains difficult for them, because MGTOW goes against their very nature. It remains difficult because they want love just as much as they did before, but after they've taken the red pill, they know that it either doesn't exist or is virtually impossible to find. For the naturally red pill man, the best way to minimize suffering, depending on how old he is, may be to have fuck buddies. But for the naturally blue pill MGTOW man, the pain is more intense. The best way for him to minimize his suffering is to cut off his emotions as much as possible by meditating every day. Meditation is like both a bath and a weightlifting session for your mind. It cleans the mind and strengthens it at the same time. It is essential for everyone to do, but it is especially important for naturally blue pill MGTOW men to do, because it will greatly diminish their pain. And this partial cutting off of emotion should not be confused with a deadening of emotion that comes with depression, or with being jaded due to an overindulgence in a certain kind of pleasure. Indulgence in emotion is often weakness, and the stronger you are, the less you will be controlled by emotions. The lack of emotions due to meditation is a choice that the meditation gives you by making you stronger. You have a choice to cut off your emotions or not cut them off. And you can, switch between one or the other as you please, because you're mentally stronger because the meditation made you that way, made you stronger. Having more options is always a good thing, and when it's more important to cut off the pain, and when you lose very little by doing so, then that's the thing to do. For example, if a person was sexually molested a lot as a child, when they were 8 to 10 years old, say, for 3 years they were sexually molested on a regular basis, and this person's, let's say, now 23 years old, if such a person were given the choice to take a magic potion that would completely and permanently erase all memories of the abuse from their mind, but would also completely and permanently kill their sex drive, I'm confident that he or she would drink the potion. Most people in that situation would take the potion. This is because the upside is huge and the downside is small. The psychological and emotional pain of the abuse, having to live with those horrific memories, is tremendously intense. It's huge. But the pleasure they get from the sex is just fleeting physical pleasure. It's negligible. Oftentimes, maybe always, cutting off one's emotions is the wisest thing to do. It's the best thing to do according to a cost-benefit analysis of the options. It's the best option. People have a sentimental attachment to their feelings, but this is not wise, because feelings are a great source of suffering, and as I pointed out earlier, it is more important to seek to eliminate pain than to seek to increase pleasure. Pain makes pleasurable things unenjoyable as well, which is another reason why it is more rational and productive to seek to eliminate suffering instead of seeking to increase pleasure or happiness. Sources of pleasure or happiness are usually a poisoned pill. They give suffering along with the pleasure and happiness, and often the suffering they give is greater than the pleasure or happiness. So to seek to increase one's pleasure or happiness is often synonymous with increasing one's suffering. But eliminating or decreasing one's suffering is not always synonymous with decreasing one's pleasure or happiness, and even when it is, which I admit that it often is, you get a higher and better form of happiness by eliminating the suffering, and that higher form of happiness is more refined and more satisfying than the happiness you gave up in order to eliminate the suffering. Happiness is not just emotional, it has to do with health, wealth, mind, etc. Happiness of the mind is just as real as emotional happiness, and unlike emotional happiness, it's clean. It can be fickle, like emotional happiness, but it's not poisoned the way that emotional happiness is. There's nothing wrong with being a robot. Robots can be friendly. Robots can be kind. Robots can be productive. Robots can be wise. Robots can be benevolent. Robots can be generous. Robots can be creative. Robots can be noble. This has been Redshift. I hope you got something out of this video, and if you did, then press your Android digit down on the mouse to click the like button. And if you didn't, then press your fleshy finger down on the mouse to click the dislike button. Peace.